Okay, good. Can everyone see me? Hi, everyone.
Yep.
Welcome back. I hope you had a nice lunch. As we discussed this morning, the idea this afternoon is to get a little bit more in depth into the actual application process. So what happens at the NEH when you submit an application? And for the first part, I'm actually going to ask the four panelists to turn off your videos just for the first. I have about 10 to 15 minutes of introductory stuff, and then I'll call you on stage. These metaphors don't work virtually, but they're fun to say anyway. Yeah, so I'm just going to go over application process first. We're going to run a mock panel as part of that discussion, so you understand what happens when those applications get in front of panelists. Then after the mock panel, I have just some general grant writing tips, application writing tips, things that we've seen over the years that you might find helpful. And then after that, I think Nicole and I are going to have a chat about humanities, grant making, the weather, whatever comes up, and you're welcome to stay for that. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, hoping I can make this work. Here we go. I need to actually start the, here we go. Hope you can all see that. If you cannot, let me know, but I'll get started. All right, so what happens when you submit an application? First thing, as I mentioned in the morning session, it goes through a panel sort. That is, the staff tries to cluster them into understandable clusters. Usually those clusters are done by sort of old school discipline, so US history or anthropology or whatever. But sometimes we do, if we see trends, so we may create a panel in migration studies. We may create ancient world. I'm trying to think of other environmental humanities. So sometimes we see these themes emerging, and then we look for very multidisciplinary scholars in that theme or who work in that theme from different perspectives. And that's unusual, but it does also happen. Those panels get sent to a group of scholars, as I said this morning, anywhere from 3 to 7, usually more like 4 or 5. Those panelists review the applications that for a month, then they meet with staff, NEH staff, in person or virtually to have a discussion, and they provide their recommendations to the staff. The staff takes those peer review recommendations, and we make our own recommendations. So unlike NSF, or some other funding agencies, where the peer reviewers are the deciders. So peer reviewers at NSF are asked to rank proposals from these are the ones that should be funded down to those are the ones that should not be funded. We don't do that at the NEH. At the NEH, it is more like sending an article into a journal where the peer reviewers are giving their perspective, but ultimately the editors decide whether to publish it or not. That is the same really at the NEH. So peer reviewers provide a recommendation. Those go to the staff. The staff then provides their recommendation. And often we take into account either bureaucratic hurdles, things that panelists may not be familiar with, but federal regulations. We also look at things like advocacy and activism. How that's defined is very vague in the government. So we have to go off of sort of the history of how it's been interpreted. We have to think about how those higher ups are going to perceive a project. Then we make our recommendations. 99% of the time we agree with where things lay out with panelists, but there will be cases where something may be highly rated and we may not recommend it. And I can explain a bit about why that happens if you're interested. But again, it's usually things like activism or advocacy. Sometimes it's panelists can often be swayed by topics that are very timely or a project that seems very urgent. But the fundamentals of the project, the methodological explanation or the timeline or the budget are problematic. And that's where we as grant makers might step in and not recommend something, saying the peer reviewers understandably thought this was important. However, the other 4 criteria, which are things like methodology, timeline, feasibility, are not good, and the panelists didn't address that. They only focused on significance. And in those cases, we might not go with a peer review recommendation. So we make our recommendations to the National Council on the Humanities. The National Council is appointed by the White House and confirmed by the Senate. We have a mixture on every National Council. There will be a mixture of scholars and humanities practitioners, museum directors, who are appointed from all different administrations. So when I joined in 2018, there were still council members who had been appointed by George W. Bush. And so currently we have appointees from the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and now the Biden administration. So it is a mix, and it's a really interesting mix, but the fundamental truth is that members of the National Council are experts. They are major figures in the humanities, and I've always enjoyed working with all of them. So whatever your political leanings, be aware that these are very thoughtful, careful humanists, not political hacks. I think that's what I'm trying to get across. Ultimately, they are also a recommending board. They do not make decisions. Those decisions go to the chair. And the chair, who's currently a woman, Shelley Lowe, she makes ultimately the only decision. She takes peer review recommendations, staff recommendations, and National Council recommendations into account and makes her final decision. And she's the only deciding body at the NEH. So that is the full steps that your application has to go through. Think of all those levels of review. And then if it's funded, you get the award notification. Peer review is advisory, as I said. It includes both the panelists and the members of the National Council. We generally look for educated generalists, particularly in research, because we get applications in all disciplines and all different fields. We look for panelists who have a broad background, not just in one specific specialty, but those trained broadly. And we definitely look for those with strong general interests in the humanities. It may include a specialist, but you can't bank on that. So you should generally assume that you're writing an application to generalists in the humanities. As I say, it's usually going to be like if you're in history, it'll be to historians, but you can't guarantee that they will know what you're talking about. So it's really important to speak to your peers as if you're talking to colleagues in other departments. As I mentioned, the panelists change over 100% every year. So in the same program. So if you apply to fellowships and you're rejected and you apply the next year with the exact same project, just improved, tweaked because of panelists' comments, you will have an entirely different set of panelists and they will not know that you applied previously. So we want every application to be treated as new every time. And as I said this morning, we're open to volunteers. So we'd love it. If you're interested in reviewing, it's the best way to learn how to apply for an NEH grant. Shoot me an email, get in touch with me, and I can connect you with whichever program sounds the most interesting for you to review. I mentioned this earlier, just in case you weren't there. You have a right to privacy as an applicant, transparency, and information. And we will give you as much information as we are legally allowed. Generally, it's panelist comments and maybe some staff comments. If you're still very confused, you are allowed to FOIA an application. That's the Freedom of Information Act. And that is an official legal process by which you submit a legal request to the NEH for more information as guaranteed by FOIA. Even still, panelists will remain anonymous, but you'll get maybe a little bit more information about what happened inside. Generally, I don't recommend it. It's a bit of a tedious process, but what usually happens is an institution might find that they're failing to get grants in an area, like every time they apply to education, they don't get a grant. So they might FOIA all of the applications they submitted to education, trying to get a broader sense of why they have been unsuccessful in applying. All right, so this afternoon, we are going to be looking at 3 fellowship applications. These are actual narrative statements from applications submitted to the NEH Fellowship Program. And we have 4 very distinguished panelists this afternoon. So I will ask the panelists to come on, and I will stop sharing my screen temporarily so you can all see them. I'm not sure how this is going to work, but let me stop the share. And if the panelists can come on board, and maybe Ron, maybe you can introduce yourself And then we'll go to Catherine. Oh, you're muted, Ron.
Thanks. Yeah. So, yeah, Ron Broglio, and I work in environmental humanities in the English department, as well as the associate director for the Institute for Humanities Research and directing Desert Humanities.
Perfect. Thank you. Catherine, and then Will.
Catherine O'Donnell, professor of history, and I work on the Atlantic world, 18th century, religion, revolution, this sort of thing. Will?
Great. Thanks, Catherine.
Hey everyone, my name is Will Hedberg. I'm an associate professor of Japanese and Silk. I'm also the associate director for the Asia Center.
Great. Thanks, Will. Mike?
Hi, I'm Mike Tueller. I'm a professor of the classics in the School of International Letters and Cultures. I primarily work on poetry of the Hellenistic period, which is right after Alexander the Great.
Very old worldy like me. Excellent. I'm just going to once again share my screen. So we have 3 applications today, and I will unshare for the discussion, obviously. We have African origins, infants and infancy, and Islamic literacy in, or I'm getting an error message, hold on. Islamic literacy in early America. The panelists read all 3 applications, sent me preliminary comments and scores, just as they would as a panelist at the NEH. We get preliminary comments and scores, then we gather them together to meet with us. And we have them discuss and give their perspectives to each other. We ask questions, they ask each other questions, and then afterwards they're allowed final comments and final scores. And those are ultimately the ones that are the deciding scores. But all of those comments, preliminary and final, are taken into account. And all of those comments, preliminary and final, will be shared with applicants afterwards. We gave them the 5 criteria for the fellowship program: intellectual significance in the humanities, the quality of the applicant's work. So looking usually at their CV, obviously we don't have CVs. Can you all still see my screen? Yes. All right. I guess I'm ignoring them. No. Okay. Let me try this again. Not sure what's going on. Okay. Can you all see my screen now?
Not yet.
Okay. I'm not sure what's happening. Well, maybe I'll say it out loud. The quality of the project itself. But is it up? Yes. Sorry, I can't.
Chris, maybe you should log out and log back in.
Chris, would you like me to use the backup PowerPoint? And I can share it from my screen.
Okay, everyone, if we can just hold on while Chris comes back. He's having some internet connection problems.
Okay, well, I was booted out, so maybe that solved the problem. Can you all see me or hear me now?
Can hear, yes.
Okay.
I hear and see you, not your screen.
Sorry about that. All right, let me try sharing again. Apologies. I don't know what happened. That was exciting. Share that. Current slide. All right, can we see that? Yes, okay. 5 criteria. I'll leave them here just a second, and then I'll quickly move on. But these are the 5 criteria they were given. These are the 5 criteria we give for fellowships even today. So that is normal in other programs as well. Need is not a criterion. I said that this morning. So it should never be, oh, well, the person already has a fellowship from somewhere else, so we shouldn't give them a fellowship here. That's not what we do. We ask them to give 1 of 5 scores. So here's how it worked out. So Islamic literacy came out on top with 3 E's and a VG. Black music's African origins came in second with E, VG, VG, VG. And infants and infancy is lower down. And so what we're going to do today is I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And we're going to turn to our panelists. And we're going to start with the Islamic Literacy in Early America Project. And I've asked Mike, who gave it an excellent. So we always start discussion with the highest scoring or one of the highest scoring panelists, even if it's not their specialty. We want first voice out to be strong in favor of the application. So Mike, please give us your opening statement.
Sure. Okay. So just to sort of briefly characterize this in case, I mean, the panel has read it, but in case anybody in the audience has not had a chance to look over it thoroughly, in my opinion, actually, the title slightly sells short what the piece is doing. It's not merely about Islamic literacy, really. It's about people in the early history of the United States, who some of whom are, among founding fathers types, who are significantly better acquainted with Muslim literature and the Islamic world than I think anybody, certainly me, would normally expect, and the ways in which that informed their thinking as they craft sort of a lot of what American culture has since become. Yeah, that's the basic idea. My first thoughts on it, as regards sort of the intellectual significance of the project. I mean, I must admit, I was surprised and thought this was exactly the sort of thing I would have loved to know. So it immediately struck me that way, that it would definitely make an impact in that respect. And it's also this sort of project that it's easy to see why it hasn't been done yet. It not only sort of works against normal prejudices, but also requires a package of skills that don't often occur together. And so that was, that really sort of rang large in the intellectual significance part for me. The project, we're asked if these projects are well organized. I confess I don't know if I'm very good at deciding these kinds of things. But basically, since this one had a chapter outline that was quite detailed, it seemed to me pretty clear that he knew where these pieces were falling. It didn't have a through line of an argument from beginning to end. In my opinion, that doesn't matter a lot, just because these through lines tend to change over the course of writing and researching a book anyway, so that didn't concern me, but it might have concerned others. Of course, we didn't have a CV, which would have been the easiest way to tell if the person was qualified, but there were plenty of other hints, especially that the candidate had worked on a previous book that was essentially the reverse of this. So cultural exchange going the other direction, but between the same parties, essentially. And so that made me think that the candidate was very well qualified. It's also already had a look in from a major press. So seemed to me likely to be completed. And frankly, I thought the whole project was just darn exciting.
That's great, Mike. Thank you. Catherine, I think you shared those views. Do you want to go next?
My analysis was remarkably similar, right down to not liking the title. This is not something that's been done and not something I can imagine other people being able to do, right? So funding this project is bringing into existence something interesting that otherwise, we wouldn't have. I liked that there's something familiar to it, good old Ezra Stiles, right? And Ralph Waldo Emerson, and then something quite unexpected, which is their surprising familiarity with Islamic texts. I did have things to quibble with, and in addition to the title, I thought that actually some of the ways the author did frame the piece were not particularly expressive, sort of they were almost punny private investments in public, and didn't convey, I think, what's really interesting, which is just a fairly traditional form of literary analysis through individuals, but with unfamiliar source material and skills involved. So I also was Team Islamic Literacy.
Great, thanks, Catherine. And just to break the third wall, so one thing that Mike brought out was the book chapter outline. That's a great thing, particularly for research grants. If you're applying to eventually write a book, providing that chapter outline helps reviewers a lot to understand how research and writing will actually create something. And Catherine, I loved what you said there also about you know, how surprising it was, and how they used knowable hooks like Ezra Stiles and, you know, Emerson, so that even non-specialists, generalist panel could understand the significance of this work, because there's obviously such a large canon out there with that work. So it ties in easily, right? So that's great. Ron, you also gave this an excellent, and then we'll go to Cranky Will with the VG.
Great, yes. I mean, the other panelists have already covered a lot of this. One of the things they'll add to what's already been said is that it's incredibly readable as an application. So if you imagine panelists like myself and the rest of us who are busy with their worlds outside of the singular focus of your application, then in fact, having something that's legible and formatted well and easy to comprehend the breakdown of it. I understand the chapters. Each chapter is on a particular author or well-known figure. It's clear which archives they're going to research, some of the takeaways from these particular chapters. So all that really contributed to the ability to access what the applicant wanted us to get from the piece. The other element, the only downside that some people have already mentioned is what was the bigger picture here? What was the Islamic world, and what was the US thinking about the Islamic world at the time? And how does this contribute to that understanding? I could kind of maybe hope at the intro or conclusion they could do that. Both Mike and Catherine have gestured towards those kinds of questions, and perhaps Will do the same. So I'll hand it off to Will.
Thanks, Ron. What you said about clarity of expression, right? That's one of the criteria. And just like you said, when reviewers are given 20 to 25 applications and they've got busy lives and they're getting paid almost no money to do the work, the clearer an application can be, the better. Declarative sentences, not complex prose. You know, this is not an essay. This is not a, you know, creative writing. This is a technical document to convey information to panelists. So that's really important. Will, please.
Sure. I think, you know, in terms of the many positives of this application, I'll end up repeating my colleague. I thought it was a tremendously engaging application. Even within the short span of a page and a half, I learned a lot. I'm not a specialist in American literature or history. I was, you know, largely unaware of this very intriguing points of connection that this author identified. I think the case studies are very well chosen. The author did an excellent job of demonstrating his or her familiarity with the archive. There was a feasible, if ambitious, timeline. I don't know if anybody else shared. They're a little bit concerned about the timeline going from completing archival research to a polished manuscript in 12 calendar months. You know, maybe it's just my weaknesses, but to me that seemed a little bit ambitious. But overall, a really you know, very impressive project that makes us see kind of a familiar story from a very new light. So I appreciated that. I was the cranky reviewer I see now. I think one thing that detracted me, was the deciding factor in me giving it a very good, was, as Mike mentioned earlier, there was no clear through line connecting the different chapters. There were, you know, 6 very interesting case studies, all of which, you know, in a lot of ways, similar groups of authors interested in similar themes around, you know, roughly the same period of time. But especially, again, if I'm reading 20 of these applications, I would have liked to have been hit over the head a little bit more with the thesis. What is the methodology? What is a specific thesis uniting these, these 5 different authors? Clarity was big for me. This might seem really petty, but there was kind of a prosodic objection. There were a lot of, to my mind, kind of imprecise gerunds that, rendering, amplifying, catalyzing. I would have liked to have known what is the argument, right? I don't know what it means to render a source. What are you doing with these sources? So it was minor, but just kind of clarity of certain key sentences was the deciding factor for me in terms of bumping it down that one notch. But again, really wonderful application.
That's great, Will. Thank you. And those were great comments. And actually, one of the questions I was going to ask the panel was about the work plan. So given that you raised that, what do the rest of the panelists think of the feasibility of the work plan? So if we turn to, I think it's page 3, where he talks about this, right? Maybe it's still on page
Actually,
4.
right on the first page.
Yeah, so it's page 1, sorry. What do we think of the feasibility of that? Is that overly ambitious? Is it just ambitious? Is it normal? Do we think, I mean, usually obviously you'd have a CV, you could see maybe he's written 12 books and
Right.
therefore probably knows how to do this. Does anyone have concerns other than Will?
I mean, I didn't. Maybe I was foolish not to have. I mean, what I saw. So at the beginning of that, he's that he's already done a lot of archival research already, and so I guess it's really hard to tell from this what that means. I mean, for some people, having done a lot of archival research means that you already have a bunch of quotes disposed into what amounts to an outline, and you just need to, write some prose to connect them, and you can write a whole thing in a year. And I guess this is probably building on my own research experience. I mean, for me, it takes forever to assemble the quotes and stuff I want, and then I can actually write pretty quickly. So I guess I was seeing it through that lens. But Will makes a good point that actually, looked at it without those glasses on, yeah, it might be a little ambitious.
Ron or Catherine, any thoughts on the work plan?
I think no, I think Will brings up a stage point. The chapters were detailed enough so that it seemed to me that the author had a sense of his way through the material. And in an odd way, my guess was that these are going to be case studies. Like this is going to be kind of a cornucopia approach. Look at this, which might speed the writing, right? He has interesting or he or she has interesting things to say about each, but you raise a good point, Will.
Yeah, and it was a great point about the case studies, right? Just as again a note on grant writing, if you have case studies, you better explain why these case studies, or if you're like, I'm going to use this archive and only these 500 documents, why those 500 documents? This is a classic panelist question. Why those? Why these? So as an applicant, you want to make sure to be very clear in explaining why you've picked what you've picked, even if it's to say, I've picked a selection for this book to give a breadth of understanding of the different types of authors, and the different types of engagement. And that's okay, right? As long as you say why. Ron, did you have anything to add on the work plan, or you don't have to?
The only thing I would add in the section, there's another section called skills, competencies, and access. They just list a whole bunch of awards and grants they've received to do some of the archival research. So they're kind of showing this is stuff that's already been done, as well as having had a first successful monograph. I do think, yeah, it's an ambitious plan, maybe not done within a year, but perhaps within a year and a half or so. But in any case, yeah, point well taken there.
Yeah. And another thing we like to say at the NEH, better too ambitious than not ambitious enough, right? Better that they say, I'm going to get all this done in 12 months. Now, if it's totally unfeasible, then that's something else. But better that than to say, I need 12 months to write a chapter, right? At that point, you know, you write too slow. So that's a great point. Now, normally at this part, so all four panelists have given their sort of initial comments. We've had a little discussion. This is where the NEH staff might step in. So I have a question for the panelists. And we as the panel chair are neutral. So we are not meant to bring our own expertise. We're not supposed to bring in other information, but we're allowed to ask leading questions to force discussion. And in this case, do any panelists have concerns over the use of the terms Islamic, Arabic, and Persian? Does the author make a distinction between the fact that there are Jews, Christians, other religious groups that used Arabic and Persian, particularly in these early documents? Many of them were Arab Christians or Persian Jews. Is there any understanding that they're not conflating all Arabs and Persians as Muslims? And there's no mention of Turks or Kurds or other language groups. Is that a concern to any panelists?
I will only note that I became aware of this when I was writing my summary and thought, why am I writing Islamic text? Like, I became anxious about the use of that word and thought, this is not my expertise. So I am going to hope someone on the panel is able to work with this. So maybe that's not very assertive, but that's where I ended up on that.
It's fine.
One thing that was impressive about this applicant is that, I mean, it's rooted in, primary language scholarship of some very, very difficult languages. So I think it was good that he or she delimited, these are the two languages that I have competence in. It seems to me that, their background, they're much stronger in Arabic and Persian language sources than, something like Turkish or something like this. So, and to me, it seemed like a deliberate delineation based on their particular competencies, but that's a little bit speculative, I guess.
Mike, run any concerns with that?
I mean, I'll go ahead and confess that I was not as alive to that as I should have been. So yeah, I mean, it does seem, and this may be sort of putting the causation the wrong way, but it does seem that those are, it is primarily the Quran, but also other sources in those languages that are being dealt with by the characters he's talking about. But the fact of Turkish in particular is one that, yeah, one would have expected.
Great. Okay, so we've had our discussion. At this point in a panel, I would say, panelists, if you have nothing else to add to the discussion, go ahead and write down your final comments and scores, which obviously we're not going to do here. But what I will ask is each panelist to let me know if they're going to keep this score or change their score. So Ron, you sticking with an E? You could just nod or yes, or yes. Will, sticking with VG? Okay. Mike, Catherine, are you sticking with your E's or sticking with E's? Okay, so the scores don't change on this one. Still incredibly strong score. 3 E's and a VG is pretty good chance of funding, or at least being recommended for funding, I should say. All right, let's move on to the logic of Black music's African origins. In this case, I asked Ron as the E-rater to start our conversation.
All right, just pull up my notes here and right. So one of the things that struck me about this, I'll go ahead and give an overview, which is actually a quote from the application. My book project, The Logic of Black Music's African Origins, Music, Africa, and Race in the mid-20th century, fills the lacuna of scholarship on Black music in the period between the Negritude movement of the 1920s and civil rights, the Cuban Revolution, and Black Power movements of the late 1950s and 60s, showing how this group's attempt to solve the problem of racism and colonialism via the conviction in music's capacity to bridge ethical and political gaps across cultures were complicated by the failure to shake Black music's losses from the epistemology of Western historical time. So that's obviously a hugely ambitious project in a lot of ways. And usually when you say ambitious, that can go one of two ways. Either the piece is too loose and trying to do too much, or it's capacious but seems to be able to hold together. And I was intrigued by the idea that they were working through racial and colonial problems through an ethics and politics of music and dance, and how those were represented in America, as well as how they might be re-represented or changed. I thought that was incredibly novel and compelling and timely in the conversations happening in these fields. So for a lot of those reasons, I found that particularly interesting. I like the focus of it as well. I thought it was sort of, bracketed in a way, okay, 1920s to 1960s. Clearly there's stuff before and after that would make it too broad. And it included a lot of some focal figures we know, as well as maybe we don't. The downsides of it, do I go ahead and do that stuff as well then, Chris?
Yep.
Yeah,
Just give
okay.
us your full
So
comment.
so there are a lot of characters involved. There are a lot of players, a lot of actors, and it was sometimes hard to both follow the threads as well as understand how all this was going to pay out in the book. So there was that element, as well as perhaps a small personal hobby horse is a kind of academese in writing that made it a little less accessible. It was clear that, this is like the language that we use often when writing, but then when writing to a more general group that again is reading a lot of stuff, the imperative to have to slow down and almost read carefully sentence by sentence was sometimes a little bit of drag on the flow of the thought and the piece, the application itself. Actually, the scholar has shown that they can publish both. They published books in the past. They published a lot from this work, so that there's a interest in it and there's a feasibility of writing it. So in those ways, I thought, yeah, this is compelling. I've seen similar kinds of works on more single or groups of either authors or groups coming out over the last few years. So I could see it fitting into a category of work. So in a lot of ways, I thought, yeah, this is something that will eventually find a home. Okay, so that's my thoughts on that.
That's great. Great opening statement. Thank you, Ron. Will, why don't you go next? The rest of you gave VG, so we'll just go down the line.
Yeah, a lot of what I would echo Ron and a lot of my feedback for this one. I thought it was an excellent project. Very ambitious, for the most part, very clearly delineated, although I also had a couple issues with that. Genuinely interdisciplinary. This person really is working in a number of different fields. Music, visual culture, African diaspora studies, and I really see a lot of potential in terms of bringing together these different audiences around a common set of focal discussion points. On that note, I really liked how the author went back and forth between occasionally very dense academic prose, but then these kind of larger questions. The first paragraph ended with this kind of series of questions that were, broad enough that I, a scholar of early modern Japan, could buy in and get excited. So for the most part, I feel like they did a very good job of, explaining why everyone should be interested in this project. Very clear timeline, good justification for how the fellowship period will be spent. They've published a lot on this topic. They've been in dialogue with, I think, Duke University Press. So it seems like the groundwork is sort of prepared for a very successful fellowship. Just to echo Ron, my only objection was that not only was there an occasional lack of clarity, but it was often in very key sentences. I sort of saw the topic sentence as being the first sentence of the second paragraph that begins my book project. And that was a sentence I had to read several times. It made general sense. I was on board with the project, but to really understand all the different nexes that were coming together, I had to reread that several times. Same with, I think, the fifth paragraph. There's another really crucial sentence explaining what's exactly at stake. It was a very, very dense sentence. So I think just by kind of cutting a few of these crucial sentences into more manageable chunks, this would be, absolutely stellar.
Yeah, that's great. So again, clarity of expression is so critical, particularly when reviewers have very limited time and they have to read so many applications. If you bury the lead, right? If you bury your research question, your thesis under prose, or put it like on halfway down page 2, that's the significance needs to be upfront, and it needs to be clear. Your methodology needs to be clear. So that's absolutely right. Catherine, you want to go next, and then we'll go to Mike? Mike.
So I also found much to admire about this project. So it has popular culture, politics, collaborative scholarship, transnational organization, right? It just has a lot of themes that are genuinely of interest, as well as sort of the idea of Africa and the non-African imagination. I objected maybe even more strongly than Ron and Will to some of the writing, in that I had the experience that when I did reread some of these sentences, I still did not know where I was. And to the specific analytical problem that caused was one of perspective. So for example, I couldn't always tell whether the author was making an argument about how the scholars he's studying saw time in Africa, about how time in Africa were understood in the popular conception against which those scholars were reacting, or whether he was making a comment about how time in Africa are to be understood. So there was it went beyond, I thought, jargony writing to a kind of lack of conceptual clarity, which was why I dropped it to a very good, because again, there's really a lot to admire here.
Great. Mike, you want to go?
Can I confess that I was thrown first by the fact that he didn't seem to know what the plural of lacuna was? But
Leave it to a classicist.
Yeah.
Ouch,
Anyway.
Mike.
So, I mean, I think my comments are pretty similar to Catherine's. Maybe, I don't know if I think I might be less specific actually than she, but I mean, I've actually been, trying to educate myself a lot about early and mid 20th century Black thinking lately. So a lot of these figures were actually fairly, at least somewhat known to me in their outlines. And it's, we know that sort of Black self-characterization in the US in this period is really problematic and goes in a number of different directions. And so, would definitely repay academic study as it has received, but I haven't seen it in this particular facet, right? And the facet of music and dance, very deserving, especially because music and dance in America, and especially its connection to the Black community, has been racially problematized for as long as it has existed. So yeah, this is, I really felt when I was reading the title and reading the first paragraph, yes, please, let's do something like this. I also thought this is the sort of thing that would be great for a general audience, but I don't think this guy could write for a general audience, or a woman could write for a general audience. It doesn't seem that way. That's okay. I mean, it would also be definitely worthwhile for an academic audience as well. But the thing I kept trying to find is, we start in this very problematic place of self-definition, but then, and then sort of the Black community and its interaction with dance and music is then moving away from, within, or what, with respect to that idea. I mean,
did we lose Mike? Uh-oh. There's a gremlin in this Zoom, and it's going after us one by one.
is there a direction? I could never find what the direction of these thinkers and artists was. And if you want to say there's none, that all they did was sort of swirl around and cause more problems, he could have said that too, or she, you know, could have said that too, but I just didn't find it any particular place. Anyway.
Okay, we lost you for a little bit in the middle there, Mike, but we got the gist. So
My
no worries.
apologies.
It was a pause. It was a pause. Don't worry. Something you brought up, Mike, which I wanted to ask the group is the conception of Africa here. Did anyone find it problematic? And I point you to the second paragraph, halfway down. I conceive of Africa not in geographic terms, but rather as an invented temporal framework into which Africans, African Americans, and Afro-Cubans situated themselves and were situated by others as stand-ins for historical Africans. So he's seeing it as an imaginary of sorts.
Right.
Is it too undefined? And that was something you had brought up and others mentioned. Or is that okay for the concept here?
So I'm going to say I actually really liked that as a starting point. Okay, I mean, from my knowledge of, you know, sort of the early 20th century African American thinking, that really sounds right. That is how, you know, sort of self-definition was occurring, that it was more of an imaginary than truly historical. Yeah, and like I said, then what was my idea. So that part I was actually okay with.
Okay. How about the rest of you? Do you have any issues with that, or are you okay with that as a heuristic device? You know.
That was one of the moments where I found myself disoriented. I mean, I agree with Mike that sure, for some people, Africa is a place that is also a time, right? That is imaginary, but it wasn't clear to me whether that was coming from the author's mind, whether that was truly reflective of all of the scholars that he or she was studying. And there's a general kind of, and this is sort of me being historian, I always say historians are simple creatures, right? So the person paints with like a bit of a broad brush, the 19th century and so forth. And that also, I was a little uncomfortable with I don't know, just the combination of what I think will be very fine-grained analysis of these scholars, and then the world used as a kind of backdrop, and that link I just don't think is fully conceptualized.
That's well stated. Ron, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking of Sun Ra, who would then end up using the idea of I'm from Africa, I'm from another space and time as a way of placing a set of relationships on his culture and surroundings. So like, hey, I'm black eye in Alabama during George Wallace, you know, and so there was predecessor to him, and so we're seeing this as part of an ongoing conversation. Certainly things that happened in the Return to Africa movement in the late 19th century, and then, you know, onwards into what was projected both onto these figures as well as how they took it and ran with it in different directions.
Great. Any other thoughts on this?
I mean, I would say one thing, you know, when if we're talking about Africa as essentially an invented thing in the minds of diaspora communities, I mean, the place that all comes together is Pan-Africanism, where then those communities encounter one another and proceed to have problems. You know, and you know, that's
CF
That's a-
Liberia.
many other cases, but yes.
Yeah.
And so, honestly, I mean, if I had heard, that this is what we're heading toward, we're heading toward, sort of Pan-Africanism and how that sort of plays out, that might have given me more of a hook to say, well, at least I understood the starting and ending point. I'm not totally sure about all these parts in between, but as it was, I felt like I got a starting point. So.
And I mean, he does cite Peniel Joseph, right, who does write about Black power in international context. So I think you're right, Mike.
Yeah.
By the way, this is where the one-page bibliography that applicants would submit is very helpful, because it's not a bibliography to necessarily cite, to give the sources that you cite. It's about providing this is the canon or the context in which I'm engaging, or with which I'm engaging, or that I'm adding to. And that's where a lot of this gets worked out. These sort of very theoretical questions, which they don't have a lot of room in a 3-page narrative to really flesh it out. And actually, again, coming out of character, I think the applicant does a nice job of at least saying following the work of. So they're not saying I'm making up a new thing here. I'm within the literature. I'm responding to other scholars. That's always a great thing for an applicant to do, right? Because when an applicant goes out on a limb, and junior scholars love to do this, where they're like, I'm doing something totally unique and I'm breaking down all the walls, and it's like, okay, you're adorable. But the problem is that's then very risky. It's risky research, because it could mean that they just don't know what's out there, that they don't know that they're actually responding, to something that's been well researched and well published. So, I think the applicant does a nice job in that regard. Just for the sake of time, does anyone have any other issues they want to raise with this one? Ron, were you swayed by the VG raters? Do you think the flaws they point out are worth changing your score? Or
I will say this. I wish these people would review my manuscripts and proposals. They've been fabulous panel so far, but I'm going to stay with my score. Yeah.
And do any of you VG raters feel that you're overly harsh, or you want to change your score, or are you going to stick with the VG?
To me, the VG said, I meant by it, I do hope it gets funded, but I can see that it might not, that there might be problems. So I don't want to say it's not a worthwhile project. I definitely think it is, even with the problems. So
right. That's right. And we asked panelists to score on a bell curve, right? So we basically say, the bulk of the applications are going to be in the G to VG range. Excellence, you should really hold for those that you'd fight for. This should be funded, no question. VGs can definitely still be funded. Anything VG in the VG to E range is a totally respectable, should be funded. Maybe there's some flaws, but at the end of the day, grant making is risky, right? Like, we don't know if they're going to finish the book. We don't, so but it's good enough kind of thing. So it sounds like you're all sticking with your scores. Consistent group, I like it. And Ron, just as a side note, I've been at other universities where they do create internal groups of faculty to review each other's applications. I don't know if ASU does that, but it's something the Office of Sponsored Programs or Grants Office, or maybe Nicole and you should think of that might be something worth doing, because you can do these sorts of discussions and reviews internally, and it is definitely helpful for the applications. All right, now let's move on to our third, our poor infants and infancy proposal, which did not fare so well. And I'm going to ask Catherine to start. She was the highest scoring at a very good. And so then we'll start with Catherine. So please.
All right, people, hear me out. So the vices and virtues of this proposal are quite distinct from the vices and virtues of the other. So I think I just wanted to have its airing. And it has this cool idea, right? What if we looked at something that is obviously interesting, babies, and put that in the context of capitalism and political change and medical change and technological change. And the author notes that he or she has written books for kind of trade presses or books that have gone beyond the academy before. And the writing style of this is not recondite in the way the last proposal was, and maybe the first proposal was too. So those are some positives. It is overstuffed, right? The scholar, babies are everywhere, and the scholar is resourceful enough to just list a huge array of possible lenses through which to look at babies, sources to use for the babies, and that will need to be corralled. And there's also a kind of a fundamental issue with this proposal, which is that the author keeps noting that he or she is going to look at the experiences of babies and babies' lives and babies' perspectives on things. But then what the sources are sources, they're not about what the baby is experiencing, right? They're about the ideas of babyhood. Right. So that's a kind of clear issue. I do think, again, just to do as much with this as possible, there's a point at which, maybe on the second page, the author writes, I shall explain how developments in American life led to changes in the lives of infants, and how perceptions of infants as investment citizens, family members, and at-risk collective dependents shaped American medicine, business, politics, culture, and daily life. And I think that's actually what this project is. It's like how ideas about babies have changed, but then babies in their vulnerability are exerting this kind of gravitational pull on American culture and Americans' understanding of the family and how society should work. So I think there's something here, and the author has the skills and resourcefulness to draw a book out of it, but it is it is a bit all over the place.
That's a great first statement. Thank you, Catherine. And I will reemphasize something that I hadn't said previously. So the first and most important criterion for all of our grant programs is broad significance to the humanities. But the way that it's actually worded is broad significance to the humanities, to the general public, or to both. And this proposal is one, as Catherine noted, that has a dual audience that maybe the other two did not. And that is something that we should think about with this proposal. But before we dive in too deep, why don't we let the G-raters, Catherine, I won't put you on the spot, but I will. The first sentence of the comment she sent to me made me laugh out loud, because she wrote, "What kind of monster gives less than a perfect score to a proposal about babies?" And she was referring to herself, because she then said, "I give it a VG." But we're now going to hear from three monsters. So, no, Ron, why don't you go next? You gave it a good.
Yeah, sure. As you know, babies, right?
Yeah, gotta love them.
And yeah, exactly. And there are a lot of them out there. This book seemed like it was still in the concept phase in pretty early stages. In some ways, I wish they'd just say that, like, hey, this is early stages. I'm doing a lot of primary work. This is what I'm thinking through. Or that they'd refine it and reapply. And actually, that's what I'm hoping they would do. That they'd take the comments, refine some stuff, have a year or two to do some work, and then reapply. A few concerns in this were, one, decide if it's a university press or a trade press. Those are very different styles of writing. You're going to be looking for different things. You're going to be writing in very different ways. And so from the outset, knowing that would determine a lot. And when you say trade press, I mean, are you talking Bloomsbury, or are you talking like Penguin, one of the divisions of Penguin? And there are huge ranges of trade presses. And so getting an understanding what that might mean. And then I think there was a delimitation of babies that was 1 year old, and I'm like, why one? Like, why cut it off? You know, like, let the babies decide. Not let the babies decide, obviously, but like, let the culture that
Co-creation of knowledge
right,
with the babies, right?
right. And so, you know, could the culture that's constructing babiness be part of what determines the idea of baby and how that fits in? So there was stuff like that was really preliminary in the thinking that I thought could have been developed prior to applying for this sort of grant.
Right. Great. So again, defining the variables. How did you decide as an applicant to cut it off at 1? What is the reason for that? And Ron, I love what you said about this being early stage, right? So those of you who were here this morning, remember I said that generally speaking, in fellowships, when you're asking for 12 months, the projects that tend to do better are in the middle to late, right? So the other 2 proposals we had, they've basically already completed all the research. They have a very good, some of them started writing already. You know, they've got a really good sense of what the book is going to look like. And this is an early stage project, and early stage proposals struggle in fellowships for that reason, because they're not, because again, you can't help but compare across, as you 4 did. And it's just the clarity of the project is not there relative to the other ones, right? So that's a really good point. But early stage is allowable in this program. So it's not that this should be thrown out for being early stage per se. But anyway, Mike, you also gave this a good.
Yes, and I actually, I think I started in the same place as Catherine did, that, you know, we're trying, it looked like there were a lot of trying to treat babies as sort of subjects here, but we never got to the baby as subject, which, I mean, honestly, it's not that surprising. Babies don't really tell us all that much, but, you know, it was never really clarified what's going to stand in for that or how we're going to reach that. I mean, the picture, it kept coming back to either baby as medical concept, which she was clearly trying, he or she was clearly trying to get away from, but the substitution often seemed to be baby as marketing object. And that actually is fascinating in and of itself, but it didn't seem that that was what this project really wanted to do. And at times, there were a few times when it seemed to take some things for granted that really took me aback. I mean, the biggest part for me was the 800 baby books that this person has collected. And it seemed to me that this is a new grab, right? I mean, this is something that I don't know that that's really been used as a source before. And so that's nice. But on the other hand, those baby books are themselves the product of camera marketing. And that didn't really seem to be explored, that, you know, we're marketing a baby's life to the baby's own parents from these Kodak camera baby books that are being, you know, sent all over the place. So, I mean, in the end, I got the impression that this was a project being done by someone who probably seemed to have real expertise in probably only one of the areas that they wanted to explore, and realized it was insufficient and was grasping for a lot more, for a lot bigger project, which I think is great, but didn't actually have the expertise to know yet where those pieces belong. So, you know, a growing scholar, you know, but I needed to see more to believe a book could come out of it.
That's great. Thanks, Mike. And I like that you brought up the sources, you know, the unusual, you know, that often if for an application, if it's a new archive, new sources or sources being used in a very new way, that kind of innovation, panelists often, like you did, they notice it and they say, wow, that's exciting. I doubt anybody's looked at these. And that can stimulate new research in ways that hasn't been done before. So that is a point in its favor. Will, what'd you think? You gave it an SM.
I was the most monstrous of the monsters, I guess. So
True.
I'm learning a lot about myself in this process. We'll start by saying I like the project and I like babies. I'm very pro baby. I had one of my own before he grew up. I found a lot to admire in this project, and I think, you know, fundamentally, as some of my colleagues have said, it's an issue of being at an early stage, which it sounds like, automatically kind of puts it at something of a disadvantage. Also, I just keep saying clarity, clarity, clarity. I marked that exact sentence that Catherine read. It's on page 2, right? I wrote it and put circles and curly cues and stars next to it and said, this should be the topic sentence. This is the thesis right here. This is what this project is really about. And it comes out, there's so much interesting material in here. And I think if that sentence had been the first sentence of the proposal, it would have gone up to good automatically. It just needed something to hang things together. And instead, the sentence, I am writing a history of babies in the 20th century. I mean, like, that could be anything. And then, it's followed with the sentence that really kind of concerned me. There's been little examination of what was done to and for babies and why. And I mean, that's just so incredibly broad. And almost also, that's kind of demonstratively false. I mean, I feel like 30% of my local library is books about babies, what has been done to them, why. And there are, again, throughout the proposal, there emerges a very specific kind of constellation of interests. But you just have to do a lot of work to figure out what those interests are, how they fit together. And again, 2.5 pages in, there's that very clear formulation where, the author, makes clear exactly what's at stake and what their kind of angle on this is, but it just takes too long to get there. Same thing kind of on a more meta level with the justification for the case studies. I was impressed by the number 800 baby books, but I don't really know what brings them together. Is there kind of a cohesive discourse in there? Are they chosen because of diversity of opinion? Same thing with the case studies or these baby biographies. I don't really know why they're chosen, who Nellie is. So again, just some sort of contextualization and some signposting about what is genuinely unique about this proposal, because there is a lot of, there are a lot of aspects that are genuinely unique, but I think I'm going to remain a monster.
That's great. Yeah, the why these, again, the why
Right.
these variables, why these, and how would that selection get made? That's part of the methodology of a project, right? And we need to know that. What did you all think of the feasibility in terms of the work plan? So setting aside some of the intellectual issues, the last paragraph on the 3rd page, my goal is to finish the first 6 chapters of the book during the fellowship period. So that's 12 months. Does that seem feasible?
I mean, my attitude on it was it's 6 chapters in 12 months is feasible depending on where you're starting. And I had a lot of doubts about the start. So feasible depends, but probably not.
I mean, presumably she's going to complete all this archival work with all the books before that point. If what she's asking for is writing time to write, which would start in this case, she probably applied in late 2009, so she'd find out in December to start in July. So she's going to have 7 months, 6-7 months before she starts the writing. Does that seem feasible? Does that, I mean, understanding that she hasn't given us a lot of information on those variables, but one question we always ask a panelist is, what do you think of the work plan? Because that's how the applicant is going to spend the taxpayer dollars, right? And so that is in some ways the most important question for all the taxpayers out there. How is my money being spent? Ron, did you have something?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I'd say, and this is true even like the C grants that we get, it's like the more specific you can be, the better in terms of work plan. Like it's hard to be not specific enough. I mean, it's like, I have X number of words written for each chapter, these are the chapters, here's how many words are written, here's what's left to be done. Like, and I just don't, it was incredibly gestural at that point. And also proof of concept I often look for. So have you published anything for this? And if you publish something in, say, The Atlantic versus in a scholarly journal, that might lean towards, are you doing the trade press? Are you doing the university press thing? So getting those first stages out of the way would really help this whole project launch. Another side note that I didn't mention earlier, though, was the bibliography looked kind of interesting, but it would have been cool to see some of those names show, or scholarly work show up in the body of the proposal, like I'm in dialogue with these people about these things and that kind of stuff, maybe, so that I understand where they're trying to fit all this stuff in and where all this scholarship fits in relationship to their own thinking.
That's a great point, Ron. Absolutely. Yes. So she gives a great whole page of sources, which is what we asked for. What is the literature you're responding to? But she doesn't engage with it as much in the application, which is so important.
Well, and for me, it was telling, and this builds in a little bit to what I was saying, about where I think the author's experience is, there are a lot of books on a lot of subjects, but the only articles are medical ones. And, it seems that that's where the author has real expertise, is in that medical stuff. And I would have liked to see that that there was more comprehension of how much there was out there, and considering, the author said that they were going to spend 15 months writing and get 6 chapters. That sounds reasonable. But the part before that happens, where they're going to be preparing, one of the things in here, let's see, during the summer of 2009, I'll conduct research in archives in Washington, D.C., and view the silent films and television episodes held by the Library of Congress. I will also read the popular magazine literature on babies. Really? At the same time as you're watching all that television, you're going to read the popular magazine literature on babies. That would take at least 3 years. And so
4 eyeballs.
Yeah, it just didn't seem that they really knew how much was out there, or so yeah.
Right, again, that early stage, they're just got a really exciting idea, but the focus isn't so there. The variables are not defined. Right, that's a great point. Any other thoughts on this proposal?
May I break the fourth wall and actually ask a question about applying? Are you putting yourself at a disadvantage by, like Ron said, just kind of being very upfront and saying this project is at an earlier stage? Needless to say, you need to demonstrate that you're mastering the archive, but is there any
No, Ron's absolutely right. This applicant would have done herself a big favor by being honest, to just say, this is at an early stage. I'm still exploring the options, and I actually need some of this money to go and get my hands into the collections to better refine the project. And she chose to ask for the writing time before she had really done the archival time. And this is where in fellowships, that's dangerous, because you're competing with people who've already done the archival work and they have a very good sense of what their book or article is going to look like. So I think Ron's right. It would have done herself a great favor to be upfront. And I always say to applicants, be as honest as you can be, right? Because you may think you're hiding something, but you are not. It's like if you're hiding something from your spouse, they're going to know. They're going to know something's up. It's just like that with panelists. It starts leaking through. So if you've got something that you're worried about, be upfront about it. Just come right out with it and say, this is the reality. This is what's happened. So we get this all the time with institutions that have gone through a rough patch, and things are been difficult, but now they're kind of on a new wave. They got a new director. They're trying to fix those problems. If they try to hide that in an institutional application, they're never going to get funded, because first of all, everybody knows, because we live in this tiny village of the humanities. And 2, it's going to be obvious when they say, well, what have they done previously? What's going on here? Like, why is there a new director? So it's always better to just come right out with these things. Weaknesses should be put front and center, to just say, here's the weakness and here's how I'm dealing with the weakness. And then you move on, right? It's a great question, Will.
Thank you.
Catherine, what did you think hearing all these?
Well, because since you've been advocating full disclosure, I was going to disclose sort of the backstory here, which is that I actually meant to give this a good also. So my criticism was entirely in line with Mike's and Ron's, and I guess because of the baby thing, I wrote very good, and then wrote to Chris and was like, oh, that was supposed to be a good. Although I did think there was a lot of virtue, and Chris said, well, do you mind like very gooding it so we have a full discussion?
I needed an advocate.
So Yeah, I do. It's not a very good, right? It is a, I do think it's a good, like, I'm not going to drop all the way down. And I think I am more in favor of it perhaps than others, because I do think it's almost like a block of marble. There is a lot there. You have to take a lot away, but there actually is a lot there. And I think the author does demonstrate some historical chops, but yeah, it's super early, and now you know my story.
So your final score is going to be a good.
Yeah.
Right. You put very good preliminarily, but having heard the conversation, thought about it more, made a mistake, you're gonna lower it to good.
Well, that we can, yeah. I mean, I literally,
That's fine.
I literally wrote good, but yeah.
Yeah.
You
Did
know,
anyone else? Oh, sorry, Ron.
Oh, one of the other things that goes with this conversation, I think, and that Will had brought up is setting the criteria by which you'll be judged. So if you say, this is an early work and I need to do this archival things, you're already setting up the criteria by which people will read your thing, rather than, as you had said, Christopher, is putting it in with everyone else's as a full manuscript ready to go kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Along those lines, Chris, so if we suppose that this person is, as I've been thinking of them, somebody with expertise in just one of the 4 or 5 fields that they're trying to work with, would it be helpful to say that up front as well? That, look, I'm an expert in medical history, but I know there's a bigger story. I want to be able to investigate to learn more about this, and confess a certain, perhaps large amount of ignorance. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Again, put your weakness out there very clear, and how you're mitigating against that weakness, how you're going to overcome that issue. And sometimes people are asking to write a book that's different from all their previous scholarship. And they'll say things like, I'm working with a colleague who is an expert in this thing, who's advising me on this part of the project, or there's an archivist at the Library of Congress who's an expert who really knows the stuff, and she's been helping me with X, Y, and Z. So absolutely, that's what you'd want to do. And one thing I wanted to make clear, so I've been emphasizing that for fellowships, these kind of early stage projects aren't as competitive, and I think this application shows it. Does that mean she should not have applied? And the answer, of course, is no, because my first slide today is have a 2-year plan. So she put in before she was ready, because she's going to get 4 amazing panelist comments, and it's going to improve not just her application for next round, which is when she actually needs the writing, but it's actually could potentially change the way she thinks about the project, right? And we hear that all the time. People say, wow, the peer reviewers you guys used actually opened up a whole new avenue that I hadn't even thought about, introduced me to archives I didn't know about, or just forced me to rethink how I was framing my project. And it totally changed the direction. I'm so appreciative. So for those of you in the audience, this does not mean that you shouldn't apply until you're ready to finish your book. It's consider the 2 to 3 year plan. Some people apply 4 or 5 years before they get a fellowship or a grant. You have to build that in. And so it doesn't mean that these are not competitive. It just means, you got to think ahead. Anything else on this application, or should we can close pen?
Just ask, would this have been a good proposal for the public scholar? Like, would this?
Yes.
Okay.
So another great point is this person applied before we had a public scholars program. And it's exactly the kind of proposal we were seeking. So public scholars applicants are either independent writers who do good solid research, humanistic research, and write for the public, things like journalists and independent writers like that, or they're academics who also know how to write well for the public, right? So those are the 2 applicant types that we get in public scholars. This woman, I think, fits in that second category. I think my memory is she's a PhD historian of science, historian in medicine, medical humanities, who also can write for the public, right? So yes, this would have probably gone to public scholars instead of to fellowships in the more modern day. But even in fellowships now today, we still get applicants like this who come from a more academic world and they want to write for the public, but they've never maybe published with Penguin, or Random House. And so they're kind of making that move. And so they don't feel they're ready to be judged by Pulitzer winners and editors at, Random House yet, just quite yet. So we still get these sort of proposals and fellowships, and you can actually apply to both. It's just a slightly different application, as you can imagine. Any other thoughts on this application? So Catherine lowers the score to G. Does anyone else want to change their score? Just out of curiosity. Let's stick with GG SM. So it would be 3 Gs and an SM. Okay. So we finished our mock panel. Thank you, panelists. Let me ask the panelists before you go off video, which of these proposals do you think was funded?
The Islamic literacy one had to have been funded. That'd be my guess.
I'm going to guess that they were all funded.
The baby one eventually. I wondered if the baby one in a resubmit.
Yeah, maybe in a resubmit, and maybe the first, the Islamic and Black Studies one. I don't know.
I would think those two were funded.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again with the big reveal that we've all been waiting for. Can you all see my screen?
No.
Wait for it.
We can see that you're sharing, but not what you're sharing.
Right.
Oh, my internet. Goodness. Can you see that now?
Still no.
I don't know, Jake, if you have a backup version. We can...
Thought you said this wasn't a black box.
Well played.
Am I still here? Started getting error messages again. All right, let me try one more time. I'm going to share. Is that working?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay. You can see now. So the question is, can I move? Yep, you can see that. All right. So the answer is we funded all three. And not only did we fund all three, we funded these exact applications. And just to further confuse you, can you guess which proposal got all excellent ratings? Infants and Infancy. It was an American Studies panel that initially started with 1 excellent rating and 4 good ratings. And the excellent panelist, the panelist who gave it an excellent, she basically argued in discussion, I understand the flaws of the application, but the grant is not for the application, it's for the project. And this is a fundamentally important topic for the American public to engage with humanities research. And here we have a historian of medicine with a background in this, who's going to bring a whole new set of sources to the public. And I think we should fund it for that reason. And she convinced the other panelists to go up. So it is the only one of the 3 that got all excellent ratings and was funded and became Babies Made Us Modern. Now, Baby Made Us Modern is a very different book from what she put in this application, right? It's more about, the focus is more on how we as a society went from talking about our babies to my babies, which she puts in the first part, I think in the first paragraph, and then it kind of gets disappeared into the project. But that ended up being the focus, and obviously the other 2 also got funded and are wonderful books. I encourage you all to read them. What does this tell us? So, I try to make sure people are aware that peer review is random. It does mean that who is your panelist will affect the outcome of your application. However, that doesn't mean you shouldn't apply. It shows that even if your application has flaws, all 3 of these proposals had flaws. I intentionally don't use applications that were perfection, right? All of them have flaws in different ways. In some cases, the flaw, for example, in Islamic literacy, as was noted by the panelists, what is the through line through these case studies? There's no explanation, right? In Black music's African origins, there's a lack of clarity. There's a lot of jargon, a lot of heavy prose that kind of forces the panelists to really try to think really hard, like, okay, is this smart or is it just noise? Is this theoretically driven and going to really have an impact, or is it just kind of, muddled in some kind of theoretical imaginary of Africa and, what does it all mean? And of course, with babies, it's so early stage, it's really struggled to get the point across because she didn't know when she applied what exactly she wanted to do. She just knew she was on to something and she knew it was important. And thankfully, there was a panelist who saw that. Now, if it hadn't been for that panelist, probably this would have gone back to her at that good to very good level. That tends to be what we call internally revise and resubmit. We go back to them and we say, here are the reviews, you weren't successful, you should think about reapplying, right? And they will hopefully take those comments, come back with a super strong application. So the panelists did exactly what I wanted them to do. So thank you all very much. I fully appreciate the work you put in. I have just a few grant writing tips. Y'all can keep your cameras on or turn them off as you want. I'm just going to go over a few.
Chris, real quickly before you move on, can I ask about the stepwise elements of, you showed the wonderful steps in the earlier session of, okay, there's the academic, or here where they're the academic folks, right? The panel sorting the reviews, the staff recommendation, etc. How much, how many, and then basically how many make it from one stage to the next? I know you've shown before the success rate for different types of applications, so maybe it's different, but more or less, like how many are making it from one to the next step?
Right, great question. So technically, all of the applications make it all the way up, as in when we create our staff recommendations into a book of our recommendations. So the staff writes a 1 to 2 page summary of every application that we are recommending for funding. And that gets attached to the application into the peer review. All of that goes to the National Council and all of that goes to the chair. So even applications that scored goods and some merits and all of that goes to the National Council and to the chair. Now, do I think the chair is reading all 1,200 fellowship applications on top of all the others? No, of course not. But technically everything makes it through. In terms of being discussed, in fellowships, as I said, there's a two tiers. We do external review, we triaged and only take 1/3 of those applications. About 400 go to the next round of review. Those 400 applications will then get another 4 reviewers and a seated discussion. And so then we take of those, what is the percentage from tier 2? I can't remember now, but we usually put forward about, out of 1,200 applications, about 90 recommendations for funding. So 90 out of 400. So about a quarter of them, or a little less than a quarter, will go to be recommended. And then the National Council is going to look at those, 90 for the most part. Although sometimes they also look at ones we don't recommend. And so those get put back into discussion, and then those go to the chair, and the chair may also pull things up. So everything technically goes all the way through. It's not a you're out kind of thing.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. Let me get to these grant writing tips, and I got to minimize the screen. Okay. Always look at the criteria, right? This is critically important. I think Ron mentioned this too. You as an applicant are told up front, this is what panelists will be reviewing. These are the 5 criteria. You should be writing to those criteria, making sure you address those criteria in your proposal, right? If the proposal asks about feasibility of the work plan, make sure your work plan is feasible, and argue for its feasibility, even if it's ambitious. You need to explain, why are you able to accomplish this within that period of time? You want to demonstrate the project's significance. Don't assume it's significant, right? I mean, even things that seem obvious are not obvious, right? So you need to argue for the significance at all times, that theoretical through line, the intellectual impact or heft. Also, sometimes, situating the project within existing literature demonstrates significance because it shows other scholars are talking about this. And here's how I'm going to add to that. That's also providing the context, right? What is the context in which you are doing this work? And then, as I mentioned, the work plan is super important. And we've actually now spun out the work plan from the narrative. So you no longer have to bury it in a 3-page narrative. You have more space in the narrative now for other things, and there's a separate page that is submitted, which is the work plan. I often recommend a work plan. A great work plan has kind of a paragraph of explanation and then a table or a timeline, you know, something very visual, very straightforward that says, you know, from January to March, I'll be doing archival work. From April through June, I'm going to be writing chapters 1 and 2, from, you know, that kind of thing, where it's just in a table, very simple, very easy to read. Otherwise, use bullet points, make the timeline, the work plan very simple to read. You don't need to use a page of prose. You'll find the panelists are very annoyed by that, since that page is only supposed to be about the work plan. How important, so this is just to sort of summarize, while every program, the criteria will look different, fundamentally, they're all the same. The significance, your ability to do the project, or you and your team's ability to do the project, the application, the declarative expression, because of course, if it's muddled, if it's full of jargon, the final product will probably also be muddled and full of jargon. So we need that clarity, the description, what's your plan, what's the work plan, and then what is it that you're actually going to deliver, right? Whether it's a book in research or an exhibit in public programs, or a nicely curated collection in an archive as in preservation and access. Remember your audience, right? So it's a generalist panel, but there may be some specialists as well. So you might need to throw a bone or two in there to just make sure they're aware that you know the literature, right? Or that you know this often comes up. There may be a controversy within your sub-discipline. There's something that in your sub-discipline, some people like it and some people don't. So it's controversial, or at least it's discussed. And you might think, well, they won't possibly know that, so I'm just going to pretend like, you know, this is normal because I believe it's normal. Better to address it, even if it's just in one sentence, to just say, while there's debate about methodology X, or while there's debate about the merits of this person's work, I will use it as a device, or I will use this methodology in order to do X. So you're at least acknowledging that. So you're acknowledging for specialists and explaining for generalists. Avoid the jargon, address the criteria, show them that you know what you're doing. Why are you and your team the right people to do this? It's not enough to just say this is important. You have to say it's important, and here's why we are the best people to do it. Finding the right program can be really tough. This is where emailing the NEH is the way to do it, right? There's an email address on every program website. You can always reach out to me if I'm the only email address you can find, but I assure you, you're better off writing directly to the divisions. All of the divisions have an email address, like the Division of Research Programs is research@nih.gov. If you write to those email addresses, somebody will get back to you within a day or two. You know, think about your options in terms of the different programs and talk to a program officer about what makes the most sense. Because as I said, you can't apply to multiple programs with overlapping project costs and timelines. So you might have to choose. And that's where, like I said, with digital humanities, better to reach out to the Office of Digital Humanities, explain your project and have them guide you. Your best bet is to apply to this program because it's closest to what you're explaining. Use your own grants office, Office of Sponsored Programs, use the Institute, use the resources on campus because they really are experts in applying for federal grants, which are complicated and they have experience. So you always want to do that. And volunteer to be a panelist. I've said that many times. I mean it. If you write to me or to anyone at NEH and said, really love to be a panelist, excuse me, I'm particularly interested in reviewing research grants or education grants or preservation access, inevitably they will try to put you on one of those panels. We're always looking for panelists. There are sample applications online. You should look at those. You can find, as I mentioned, a query, a database of successful projects. That's usually very helpful to think about where you might fit. There is draft reading for these programs, so that's very important. And after the decision, whether you get the grant or not, always ask for the reviewer comments, right? It can be incredibly helpful, even if you get the grant, in rethinking and reshaping your project. For those applying for bigger institutional grants, budgets can be incredibly complicated. This is where offices of sponsored programs are really experts at this. Don't try to go into federal budgets thinking you know how to do it because they're very complicated. So you just will need to work with them on it, but make sure to follow the guidelines about what are allowable costs and what are not allowable costs, because it will change program to program in some cases. As I mentioned, make sure to throw a draft in. If they have a draft deadline, even if you don't have a full document, you've written 3 of 9 pages of a narrative or something, just put those 3 pages in. Better that to get some feedback rather than not. Apply knowing or thinking that you'll be rejected so that you'll get that feedback and you'll apply again. If they ask for supporting material, be very careful about looking at what is mandatory versus what is optional. If it's mandatory, you got to submit it for obvious reasons. If in the guidelines it says you must do something, you must do it. It is mandatory. Otherwise, you'll see things like you have an option to. We've tried to get rid of the word should, because should is always very imprecise. So we used to a lot say you should do this in your application. That's not helpful to applicants. So we're trying to now say you must, or you have the option to, and that makes it hopefully clearer. If the program asks for letters of reference, as per usual, talk to your referees about your project. Make sure they're aware that they'll be reached, the NEH is going to reach out to them. That's very important. Proofreading, obviously, 101 grant writing, a lot of grammatical errors or typos can kill a proposal, believe it or not, because it just, the panelists are like, come on, you're sloppy. Request the comments. I said all this, and don't forget to resubmit. Revise it, take panelist comments into account, and revise and resubmit. That is the best way to get a grant for sure. So I will leave with that. There's my email address, cthornton@nih.gov. Feel free to email me at any time, and I will stop sharing. And maybe, I think there were questions in the chat, unless those disappeared, or maybe those disappeared. Nicole, should I open it up for questions, or?
Yeah, please do. So if anyone has any questions? I think there was one question from Tracy Perkins saying, was the panelist who defended the baby's proposal a woman?
That's an interesting question. I actually think it was. I don't know that for a fact, but I seem to remember it was.
Right, let me. Catherine?
I was just going to comment, that's one of the reasons I sort of showed my hand and said, I actually had ranked this a good, and then because I was in between, had been very, very, very happy to argue for it as a very good, was because I didn't want it to seem as if the one woman on the panel had been the only person that changed her score about a book about babies. Because my sense was this was not a gendered read of it, but I was also aware that everything is gendered, right? And so I love that Tracy, or whomever that was, picked up that dynamic, because Tracy, I was very conscious of that dynamic, just because of the way this worked out. So good question.
Yeah, definitely. Any other questions about what you saw in the mock panel, grant writing tips?
Hang on. An anonymous attendee says, what do you recommend as a grant to apply for a first-time applicant?
For research or for education, do we know?
No. What do you recommend as a grant to apply for a first-time applicant? Let's say research.
Being a first, so keep in mind again, so if you're applying for a larger institutional grant, these grants that are hundreds of thousands of dollars, Arizona State is the applicant, and Arizona State is not a new applicant, right? So the applicant coming to the NEH is not a first-time applier. So it doesn't matter if you, the project director, are a first-time applicant. That will not weigh into the conversation whatsoever. The only way it will be affect is if you're applying to do something that you have no experience doing, in which case panelists may say, we don't think this person is qualified to do what they're setting out to do. If you are, you've never applied to the NEH because you're a junior scholar, you've recently finished PhD, you're tenure track, you're adjunct, whatever, you know, a lot of these fellowship programs might be right for you because they are individual applications. What that means is, again, you as an American citizen or resident can submit directly to grants.gov if you'd like. We don't recommend it. We recommend you talk to your grants office at ASU, have them work with you on the application, and they can submit on your behalf, even though it is an individual award, right? And those are a great place to start your application history with the NEH. But again, when you apply, we don't take into account previous applications, right? It's not like we go back and look at your record and say, oh, but this person hasn't applied before, so they're risky. That's not what happens, right? So, and certainly panelists have no idea unless you tell them. So that shouldn't be a major factor, is I guess what I'm saying. And I would just, depending on what you want to do and what you're trying to accomplish, any of the programs are open to you.
Well, that might be a good point to go into a discussion with you, in fact, because, you know, I had a few questions around things. Well, there weren't questions, but there were clarifications that would help more junior scholars think about writing applications. What the IHR is doing is it's developing a scaffolded approach to internal grants to give faculty confidence, particularly younger faculty who aren't used to writing grants, confidence in building what I would call a track record, that is building publications in their field, right? That shows that they're a developing expert in this particular area, and also giving them confidence in how to write a narrative and what it means to match a budget with that narrative and so forth, all of those things. But what some questions come back to me a lot, some questions that are raised a lot are clarifying questions around, well, what is the difference, what does significance mean? What's the difference between an output and an outcome? There seems to be huge amounts of confusion around those things. And I'm just wondering, how would you define those for, say, junior scholars?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, you know, I define an output as the sort of physical manifestation of the activity, right? So in the case of a fellowship, an output is often a book, right? So a book is a nice output. An article is a nice output. But if nobody reads the book, there is no outcome, because the outcome is what results from the creation of the product. So I talk to my staff about this all the time, and I say, our end goal is not the production of books, because if that were the end goal, we are not climate friendly, because we are just deforesting the planet, right? And for what? Our goal are these outcomes. It's the idea of impact. And, you know, higher ed, you know, all about this great debate in how do we measure impact and, you know, all the rest of it. But in particular, the sort of outcomes that we want to see are the significance. That is, we want to see the applicant thinking about who is the audience that is going to read the book or go to the exhibit and engage with the public programming, or what is the audience for this collection that we're going to preserve through a preservation and access grant, right? What is the audience? How will they use the output? How will they use this product? And then what impact is that going to have? In the case of research, we want to see, you know, what is the research question, this sort of broad question that's of interest, not just to your sub-discipline, but interest broadly, like to historians, philosophers, archaeologists. You know, why might they say, wow, that's a really interesting question, right? What was the impact of Islamic authors on some of the founding fathers and founding mothers of the United States? That's a really interesting question for all of us to consider, right? And then how will that stimulate new research? So the product, the output of a grant, how is it going to encourage others or inspire others to go and do their own research, right? So history of babies, you know, the infants and infancy, you know, was opening up a whole new avenue of research, looking at how American society changed the perception of babies as a collective versus babies as a personal and individual thing. And she was going to use baby books, which nobody had really done before. So again, that kind of book, which could stimulate whole discussions in the American public, but also in academia, and suddenly people are going to say, oh wow, babies books, I never thought to use those, and suddenly you're going to get all kinds of scholars going and looking at those same baby books. So that's what we would see as outcome, and that's significance, right? We're never going to be able to measure that per se, but we're not trying to get tenure, right? So we just want to see that you as the applicant understand that what you're going to produce, the output, will have a broader significance because it will have outcomes.
Hence, you know, the baby book being accepted, really, because it had a, yeah. So thank you. And if you were applying for an individual grant, could you give maybe a tip on, I guess, what would be the most important component? I mean, it's only a 3-page grant, but what do you think is really important when you're writing those grants?
I mean, all 5 of the criteria are important. Obviously, the significance, that outcome, that impact is primary, but all of them are important. I would say for those individual applications, if you looked at the 2 applications we did first, right, the Islamic literacy and the African origins, they had very clear subheadings in bold that said things like, you know, methods and work plan. And then there was a paragraph or 2, and then it would say, you know, what was the next one? Chapter outline. And, you know, these very clear sections, rather than the infants and infancy, which was just one long 3-page narrative, right? Without subsections. And while subsections aren't required, that's good grantsmanship, right? And for individuals, it's a great way to use, you know, yes, you lose those lines in your 3-page narrative, but the clarity is so much greater. And that ultimately is going to, I mean, you heard this over and over from the panelists today, and we hear it all the time from panelists. Clarity, 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 clarity of writing, clarity of expression. Get those 5 criteria to us with the subheadings. You know, we give you in the guidelines, these are the sections that we need in your narrative. We better see those subheadings to show that you're addressing each single one of those, because we've designed those sections to respond to specific criteria. And we even in the guidelines on the website say which criteria respond to which section of the org narrative, right? So it's crystal clear. If you write a methods and work plan, that's going to respond to criterias 2 and 4, or 3 and 4 in this case.
Yeah. Now, with just going back to research track record, how substantial does your research track record need to be convincing?
A great question. Generally speaking, it doesn't need to be, well, it's a complicated question. If junior scholars apply, so recent PhDs, maybe not even tenure track, we define junior as up to 7 years outside of their PhD in this, for research. But a junior scholar applies, nobody's expecting them to have 2 books under their wing. You know, I mean, it's an understanding, okay, this is a junior scholar. So panelists and staff take applicants relative to their position, you know, relative to where they are in life. And so there would be an expectation that that person has done work in this field. They're not just suddenly jumping into something completely foreign to them. And if they are, most likely we want to see they've done some seed grant, they have a seed grant, they've done some preliminary work before they come to the NEH. Because we're so competitive. If you haven't done any work in the field, panelists are going to say, this isn't a good use of taxpayer funding. It's far too risky. It's far too ambitious. There are cases where we have applicants who used to do research and then they got teaching positions and they've been teaching for 10 years and they want to come back to their research. And that happens a lot. And those applications sometimes struggle in our individual programs because panelists sometimes say, you know, this person hasn't done the research in 10 years. Will he or she be able to catch up? Will he or she be able to transition back now that scholarship has moved 10 years further? And so the onus is on those applicants to make the case for why what they're doing is still cutting edge, is still going to be additive to the literature. And a lot of applicants do say, you know, I've been teaching a 4-4 load as a teaching faculty at, you know, whatever, for the past 10 years, but I've maintained presence at conferences. I've continued to read journal articles in my field, so I'm aware of the current literature, and therefore I'm ready to jump back into my research. And that's a strong case, and panelists will take that into account. So it's a long-winded answer to your question. I won't surprise you, I was long-winded, but trying to get at that it varies based on who you are as an applicant.
Yeah.
And the panelists generally and staff have an appreciation for different people are at different stages of their career.
So making that clear is very important then.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Look, most of the mock panel and also your kind of tips really addressed a lot of the stuff that I was going to talk to you about.
Okay.
So that's it from me.
Amazing.
So unless you've got something you want to talk to me about, the weather's really nice.
No, I mean, you know, maybe for the sake of the audience, you know, tell me a little bit about what the Institute does in terms of, you know, stimulating grants and grant making on campus. I'd love to know.
Well, so coming in as a new director, now nearly on 2 years, I've been at ASU, and the sole purpose was to refocus the Institute around research and develop and enabling more grant opportunities. So what we've done is built a few more grants into the grant suite, and a lot of those grants are scaffolded. So if you're a junior faculty, you can start at one level and then build up to the other grants, right? So you're building expertise as you go up the ladder of grants. Mm-hmm. And there is and right at the top is something called the strategic IHR strategic grant, and it really is a grant that you get to actually write grants, external grants, right? For the NEH, for example. Yeah. So it's really focusing and enabling, give somebody time to really produce some really good grants. And part of that is that they have to resubmit them. So they have to, if they're unsuccessful the first year, they have to resubmit it again the second year. So exactly as you said, you know, so the strategy there is to enable faculty to be able to, or increase potential external grant wins, you could say, and you can't do that unless people have got the time to actually apply for grants. Yeah. So that's one way. And then there's another way, which and then lower on the rung of the scaffolding grant system that I put in place is something called the publication grant. And that is, you get, you know, $6,000 to write an article, right? And to publish. It's simply about, here's some money to help you publish, right? To get you the money. Again, the aim of that is to build a track record.
Right.
And then building that track record enables you to apply for a higher grant, like an IHR seed grant, where, you know, you've got a bibliography developed as a result of the publications that you've done. And then, of course, the other aim of all of that is to increase external grant applications to the NEH, but also, again, to potentially increase rankings in and through for the humanities. So in and through, the more publications there are, you know, the more citations, the better the rankings, particularly for THE and stuff like that. And so, as well as through external grants. So it's kind of a twofold process in the sense that it's helping faculty and it's also helping the college and the humanities in particular be able to increase its rankings, its research reputation as well.
That's great. I think it's wonderful. And I, you know, like I said in the mock panel, I've seen other similar institutes also create essentially a board of faculty who have good experience in grant writing and grant reviewing, and serve as mentors and essentially we'll review those grants, and maybe you already do that. You know,
We
sort of-
do, yeah.
Yeah, great. So like a writing group kind of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
That's
We-
wonderful.
We have an advisory board. People are busy. Sometimes it's hard to get people on that, but there is an advisory board which people are very welcome to join. You know, and I would encourage people. In fact, I might be reaching out to Catherine and Will, and I know Mike's already been on it, but
Yeah.
So
No, the panelists you gave me were great. So
Yeah.
I mean, you know, clearly there's some great panelists on campus. Good to use them if they have the time.
yeah.
Nicole, there was a question from Lorena about what do we look for in letters of recommendation? At what point do they play a big role? It's a great question, Lorena. And in particular, you know, there's a big debate right now in the academy about letters of recommendation, particularly with jobs. And there's a big discussion about whether letters of recommendation is a form of gatekeeping that is stopping certain people to get jobs. And does it mean that only people with connections at Ivy League institutions or with big name scholars, you know, get the jobs or get the promotions or whatever? What I would say for the NEH is we have letters of recommendation mostly only for our individual awards for the fellowship programs. And partly that's because they are small applications. So the letters of reference are meant to help panelists and staff to better understand the context in which this person is applying, both about the person, his or herself, you know, the applicant, but also the importance of the project, the significance, how it situates within a discipline. So what do we look for? We just want the referees to give us as much information as they can about, you know, advocating for the project. You know, a letter of recommendation is not a peer review. It is meant to advocate for. So you as the applicant should always think about who do you think could advocate for your project. Some of the most impactful letters that I've seen come from scholars who don't know the applicant very well. So the applicant asks a scholar in their field to say, I've really, you know, I've based so much of my research on your work. Would you be willing to write a letter for me if I apply to the NEH? Here's my proposal, and let me know. And then that scholar has said, yes, I'd be happy to. This seems really important. So it's almost like we're getting a free peer review, but one that's advocating for you. So that often works very well. What doesn't work is when an applicant applies with, you know, the two members of their PhD committee, right? And unless they're a very junior scholar, that feels quite sort of incestuous, and not incestuous, that's the wrong word, but feels a little bit like, yeah, I mean, of course they're going to advocate for you, right? So it doesn't hurt to have somebody from your dissertation committee on there, but particularly if you're a more senior scholar, we like to see that you have peers. The same thing if you just have letters of reference from within your department. So that also can hurt your application. Only that panelists say they couldn't get a letter from somebody who's not a direct colleague, you know, question mark. It's not a requirement, but it's just sort of a good best practice, I would say, to try to look for some, you know, sort of a breadth. I usually recommend find one letter of reference who knows you and your research and can really talk about why you're the right person to do it. And then get somebody who can talk more about the project and its outcomes, right? And the importance within the canon or within the discipline or within whatever. And they can both address both, but when I would think strategically about finding two letter writers, that's what I would do. Do they play a big role in the application? No. The truth of letter recommendations is we do not hold them as on some pedestal. They are supplementary. They are helpful in some cases. For me personally, in the majority of cases, I don't necessarily use them. I read them, but it's not like they change my perspective. Where they can be helpful, so again, you know, think about the infants and infancy proposal. You know, she had two letter writers. I haven't read those letters, but I can imagine those letter writers probably made a strong case for why this is really important and why she's the right person to do it. And that's where it can make a difference, is where the application maybe has some flaws and those letters can help push them over the edge. I've never seen a letter pull somebody down, other than, as I say, if they only had two members of their department, and sometimes the panelists are a little bit like, or, you know, there are people who are just bad letter writers. I mean, obviously we, you know, don't punish the applicant because the referee submitted a letter for the wrong project or for the right, you know, like there's all kinds of nonsense that happens. So you as an applicant don't need to worry about that. But just think about strategically how to use those letters to convey as much information about you and the project and its significance as possible. Any other questions? And if not, Nicole, I'll just say once again, thank you and the team for inviting me. It's been an absolute pleasure. I love learning more about it. I hope I get to visit you all at some point. It's definitely on my list. And if I can ever be helpful, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to do so.
Thank you. And can we all thank you and for actually all this time you've given to us today. It's been wonderful. I've learned a lot as well. And you're so clear and you're absolutely fabulous. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. And thanks to the panelists.
No,
Yes.
thank you. I learned so much and from the other panelists too. That was marvelous. Thank you.
And can I thank the panelists too, Catherine,
Yeah.
Will, Mike, and Ron. I mean,
Bravo.
thank you for your time. It was really fantastic.
You're probably gonna get us to review for us soon, all four of you. Apologies. No good deed goes unpunished.
Yeah. Okay.
That's
Thank
great.
you, everybody, and thank you to everybody who stayed with us as well. So.
Yes, thank you, and thank Jacob for putting this all
Oh,
together.
Jacob, of course. Jacob. Yeah. Thank
Bravo.
you so much. Yeah.
All right. Have a lovely day.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.